Congratulations to you and United Therapeutics for sponsoring what is a unique conference and a remarkable opportunity for meeting people from other disciplines and interesting discussions and cross-pollination. Just since I've been here last night, I've had 3 very interesting conversations with people in other areas that may lead to collaboration, which I think is the intent of this meeting. The previous talks really do provide a nice segue into what I'll be speaking about. And I'll share with you in the next few minutes, my journey as an interventional cardiologist into the world of micro and nanotechnology, which really started as an attempt to solve a clinical problem. So it wasn't technology looking for a problem to solve, but really just trying to solve a problem in the most elegant and simple way possible. So really the impetus for CardioMEMS dates back to around 1999, 2000, when this trend became apparent to me in my everyday practice. Over the last 20, 25 years, we've done a very good job in cardiology and medicine in general of reducing the risk of dying from heart attack. So today, if you go to the hospital with a heart attack, your chances of dying are half or less what they used to be 20 years ago. Now, unfortunately, we can't make you like you were before the heart attack. So you're going to be damaged to some degree. Your heart muscle will be damaged. So you have patients who are alive now who would not have been alive previously, but they have impaired pumping capacity. And this leads eventually to heart failure, which is a decreased efficiency of the heart, leading to increased pressures inside the heart and in the lungs, which the patient experiences a shortness of breath. So this shortness of breath affects their entire life, their activities of daily living, and as it progresses, you get fluid buildup in the lungs, which leads to pulmonary edema, which eventually becomes fatal. So this is a very serious and severe disease. Now, one thing I noticed in that time frame was, and I noticed this not through this chart, but through everyday experience. I'd go to the CCU, which is a coronary care unit, and I was noticing that more and more the coronary care unit was taken up by the heart failure patients. I'm not a heart failure doctor. I'm an interventional cardiologist. I put in stents and fix things. So I was a little perturbed by why they were taking up all the space that I needed for my patients. But it also became apparent this was a real problem. And typically what happens when the heart failure patient is admitted to the CCU, he gets what's called a right heart catheterization, or Swan-Ganz catheter, which is a very old device now. Both Dr. Swan and Ganz have passed away. And what this catheter lets us do is to measure hemodynamic information from inside the heart. And then we can have very precise treatment, much more precise than we could do without the right heart catheterization. And about half the time we can get these patients better and get them out of the CCU. So the question was, could you get that type of information all the time from the patient's home and get it before they went into pulmonary edema? So the things that Martine mentioned at the beginning, which are both geographic and temporal localization of this disease state. And one thing to keep in mind is not only is this a very large problem numerically, it's also a very severe problem. We always think about cancer, and cancer is a terrible disease, but the outcomes for heart failure are worse than every type of cancer except for lung cancer. So it has a very bad prognosis. And in spite of all the advances in treatment, both pharmaceutical and device, some of which Vin Mandan from Medtronic talked about, in spite of ICD, CRT devices, beta blockers, ACE inhibitors, the 5-year mortality remains close to 50%. So huge unmet needs in a very large problem. So how do we go about trying to improve the outcomes here? Well, we can take a lesson from one of the disease states mentioned earlier, which was diabetes, which is another big chronic disease state. And here what we have is a variable, glucose, which is elevated. We have medications, insulin and other medications, that can lower that variable. But the key ingredient is that the patient has a simple test, a finger stick, to measure blood glucose that he or she can perform themselves at home as many times a day as their doctor asks them. And with this information, you have a closed feedback loop, and they can adjust their insulin and keep the glucose under control. In heart failure, we have a variable, intracardiac pressure, which is elevated. And we have lots of medication. We have no shortage of cardiac medications that can lower this pressure. However, the only way to get this information right now is through a, is through a right heart catheterization, which you see here. Now, clearly the patients can't do this at home. We don't even do it in the hospital very often. So what happens is that the first dictum in medicine is do no harm. So the doctors typically undertreat these patients, grossly undertreat them, and I'll show you some of the data. And that's why they do so badly, because these pressures are unknown, they're very high, and this leads to hospitalization. So how do we go about trying to measure this? I'm going to show you what this process looks like the way we do it now. So this is a Swan-Ganz catheter after Dr. Swan and Ganz at Cedars-Sinai Hospital. And this is you make a little incision and put a sheath in either in the jugular vein or the femoral vein. And what the brilliance of Dr. Swan and Ganz was they put a little balloon at the end of this. This balloon is inflated, so it acts like a sail. So the blood flow, this is venous blood, it's going back to the heart, simply carries the catheter. So this is a very low-skill procedure. You don't have to be an interventionalist to do this procedure. So this catheter floats up into the right side of the heart through the tricuspid valve, right ventricle, out the pulmonic valve, and advances into the pulmonary artery into the lungs. And it comes to a stop when the balloon is the same size as the artery. So a very simple, straightforward technique for getting there. This is what we do. So question, and all the literature in cardiology, hemodynamics is based upon data from this location in the pulmonary artery. So we wanted to replicate that information, and we wanted to give the doctors exactly what they were used to in the cath lab, which is the entire waveform, not just a number. Cardiologists are used to looking at waveforms. We wanted to create the entire experience that was in the cath lab. So how do you go about doing this? I think you've already heard today some of the issues with leads and batteries that Dr. Sclavasi mentioned so elegantly in his talk. And we have the same problems in the heart where all this technology was initially developed. Leads are wires that we use to transmit energy and information from the programmers and batteries, which are typically beneath the skin near the clavicle. Now, these leads typically end in the heart muscle. So we don't have leads that we put through the pulmonic valve because that would lead to compromise the pulmonic valves. Leads really aren't an option in this location. We don't want to screw a lead into the artery. The arteries are very fragile. The leads tend to fracture. They have infections associated with them. So all of these things make leads really unattractive, certainly for this application. Batteries, replacing the battery is a big deal for the patient. It requires another surgical procedure. We want to avoid that if at all possible. They're large. There's a risk to batteries, particularly if you were to put them inside the artery. We don't put batteries right now inside arteries. So what do we want? We want no batteries, no leads, ideally a device that lasts forever, which is an interesting concept in medical devices because a lot of revenue gets generated by replacement. Well, is that really good for the patient? They had to be very safe. We're talking about millions of patients. Has to have a very high threshold for safety. Again, because there's millions of patients, it has to be a simple, fast, easy implant that any cardiologist can perform quickly. And it has to be easy to use both for the doctor, the nurses, and the patient. So when we apply all these design constraints, you end up with a wireless device. And I'm saying wireless not in the room sense. We can go to Best Buy and get wireless technology. Okay, that's easy. I'm talking about wireless inside the body, which is very difficult. Small, permanent, truly permanent, and very, very efficient energy management. We've already had some discussion about energy management, and that really could be a conference in itself. And the key really to our sensor is extremely efficient energy management. So I did some research. I'm a frustrated engineer and physicist, and so I spend my spare time looking at stuff that I shouldn't be looking at. And I found two interesting sets of technologies. This is around 2000. One was at the MIT Media Lab, developed by Neil Gershenfeld, who's famous for lots of other things, including work in 3D printing and quantum computing. But one of his early areas of research was passive wireless sensing, which is very small sensors that have no energy sources, that are very low power, that require very low power, and can be powered really by passive RF communication. That's the word passive wireless sensing, which made some sense for what we're trying to do. And then we wanted very stable, small wireless sensors. And this work was being done, some of this work was being done at the Georgia Tech MEMS laboratory and some DARPA funding for military jet engines by Dr. Mark Allen. And these sensors actually are in use today. They're used in the drone airplanes that are flying over Afghanistan and Iraq. Those engines are very small, are operating at much higher pressures and temperatures than regular jet engines, so you need a lot of data from inside the combustion chamber. In that location, you can't have any wires, can't have any batteries. So it's interesting analog to the human body, where for other reasons we'd like to avoid wires and batteries. So I licensed both these technologies from MIT and Georgia Tech, and we ended up putting the company in Georgia Tech. They were very supportive of the idea. And we ended up with this. After several years and close to $100 million of R&D, this is what we ended up with, which are very small sensors made entirely using batch fabrication. This is the first medical device made as a chip on a wafer. This leads to lots of nice properties, high performance, reliability. We're detecting nanometer changes inside this sensor. Not much happens. The reliability, we've got 20 years of accelerated fatigue testing, which is unheard of in medical devices. So this thing will work far longer than the patient will live. Never need replacement. The economics become attractive once you get into, their R&D is very expensive, but the actual manufacturing, once you get into volume, tends to become very cheap. And compared to current technology, now I don't think Vin is here, but this is not a Medtronic device. This is a computing company's device, but it gives you an idea of the scale we're talking about. So these are the current electrical devices we put into the heart. They're huge. And what's interesting is we always only see the battery part. Well, you know, the leads actually, if you measure the volume of these leads, is as big as the battery. And these are inside the patient, inside their veins, and cause all sorts of issues. So I think the future will be wireless, both outside the body, but also inside the body. The operational principle of the sensor is very simple. It's a resonating circuit, a capacitor, and induction coil. Together, they form an LC circuit. As the distance between the sides of the capacitor changes, and this is dramatized, it doesn't change this much, it changes a couple of nanometers. The capacitance changes. The capacitance changes, the resonant frequency of the circuit changes, and we can pick that up very precisely. We have a lot of bandwidth here to do that, and so we're measuring a frequency shift, which we relate to a pressure shift. The external electronics, and our approach is a little bit different than Dr. Sklabasi's approach, and I'd love to talk to him hopefully later in the day. What we have done is to remove all the computation outside of the body. Mainly from my experience as a cardiologist, is the technology moves a lot faster than the patient is willing to have more surgery done. So we don't want to be changing things out as the engineers keep making things better and better and better. And also, so we have taken approaches to make the sensor very simple, bulletproof, keep the complexity outside of it so we can do upgrades, we can keep making the electronics smaller, we can do software. It just makes it a lot more commercializable in the near time frame. So what happens is the electronics transmits a radio frequency signal. The antenna transmits that, the sensor picks it up, does a little bit of work with that, and transmits it back. And this happens, depending on how we want to look at it, it's happening 100,000 times a second. We actually get 2,000 actual readings per second. So we can reconstruct the entire waveform with a high level of detail, including measuring flow and cardiac output. This is, I'm not going to show you this whole video, I'll just show you a little bit of the beginning. This is Dr. Sievert in Frankfurt, one of our investigators.
The target implant site is the left or right pulmonary artery branch in the lower lobe of the lung.
We've got audio so we can listen.
A Swan-Ganz catheter is inserted into the pulmonary artery. The tip of the Swan-Ganz balloon is maneuvered to the left or right side and into the approximate deployment location of the sensor.
That's enough, huh?
An angiogram is performed to visualize the deployment site of the sensor. An 035 guide wire is advanced through the Swan-Ganz catheter across the implant site. The Swan-Ganz catheter is removed while the guide wire position is maintained. The sensor is loaded on an over-the-wire delivery catheter. It is retained on the shaft by a nitinol tether wire which threads through the catheter shaft and through the sensor. The sensor delivery catheter is loaded over the guide wire. The sensor is advanced through the sheath valve. Then it is advanced through the sheath and into the target deployment position. The sensor is released by pulling the tether wire, which threads through the catheter shaft and through the sensor.
Okay, we saw the wires going up.
After release, the delivery catheter and guide wire can be removed.
Calibrate off the sheet, right? So I would say take everything out. So what was that? I would say pull, or just at least out of the picture. I just said,
Start moving.
Wire loops on the ends of the sensor stabilize it in the vessel and prevent distal embolization. Once in position, the sensor is detected by the external electronics. The external electronics powers and receives signal from the passive sensor using RF energy. The sensor pressure measurement is calibrated to the mean pulmonary artery pressure.
this is the kind of reading we're getting.
Notice the correlation between the measured values from the wireless pressure sensor and conventional pulmonary artery pressure measurement.
I think we can stop this. Great. So it gives you an idea. It's a very simple, quick implant. Takes 15 to 30 minutes. This is, well, it kind of keeps going on and on. We'll skip through this. So the overall flow of information is the patient has the electronics at home sit on his nightstand. The antenna typically is in a chair. They can have it in a pillow in the bed. They take a reading in the morning. Dr. Borg, who's one of our principal investigators, wanted a daily reading. Actually, Bob wanted 2 daily readings, but he got overruled by some of the other investigators. But he does 2 anyway. He does what he wants to do. So they take a reading in the morning, and the information goes to our servers and our database, and then is sent to the doctor. Now, what's neat here, I think, in terms of what Dr. Rothblatt said earlier, is the temporal specificity. So what's nice about this device, this is real-time transmission. I can get, if a patient took a reading now, I could get it on my BlackBerry right now. And doctors in our study have done this. Patients will often call up with non-specific complaints. You know, these are elderly patients, have a lot of diseases, they don't feel good, and the assumption is always that it's their heart. Well, it's often not their heart. So if a patient can call up a doctor and say, look, I'm not feeling well, the doctor can say, take a reading right now while we're on the phone. And I've literally had this happen. I've seen this happen. And the patient will take a reading, and the doctor can tell him real time, okay, you know, your pulmonary artery pressure, your cardiac status is good, it's not good. And this is just, you know, this is really remarkable. You know, Bob was saying what's remarkable for him. Even for me, this is remarkable that we can get data that, you know, now we do this big procedure on these patients in the hospital, in the operating room, and we don't have to do that anymore. So there we go. Yeah. It's great. Bob is much more on top of this than we wish all our doctors were this responsive. So what we're trying to do here, just finishing up, what we're trying to do is to interrupt this chain that you see here. First, you've got heart damage from hypertension or heart attacks. Then the pressure goes up. And then the last thing you get is what the doctor's actually treating, which is the clinical symptoms. You really have to intervene before the clinical symptoms occur. So we have to change this chain into a more of a, you can't see some of this, from a reactive to a proactive paradigm. And that really will impact both patient care, but also our healthcare costs. So we're doing a large study now in the United States, 550 patients, randomized, blinded study, highly powered. The endpoint is hospitalizations at 6 months, lots of other secondary endpoints and cost effectiveness data. And this study is well on its way. We're actually at about 400 patients now. And we should complete enrollment before the summer. Study's gone very well, very high technical success rates, no unanticipated events, and very high patient compliance. We have a lot of data now. We've got 70,000, over 70,000 readings in the system already. So we're learning a lot about patient responsiveness to different types of medications. We've demonstrated very good correlation with repeat right heart catheterizations. Obviously, this is an important consideration. We've demonstrated this in the feasibility study and also in the ongoing study, patients who happen to come in for a repeat procedure because they're getting a transplant or a left ventricular assist device. I'll show you a couple of case examples. These are a little bit complicated, so I'm not going to kill you with all the detail here, but this is from a prominent heart failure hospital like Dr. Borges Center at Ohio State with Dr. Abraham. So experienced people treating patients with state-of-the-art therapy with ACC/AHA guideline therapy. And what you will see here is, first of all, how many medications they're on. All these poor patients are, oops, I keep saying the wrong button. are on a lot of medications. And he's got a CRT device and an ICD. So he's getting everything he can get. Yet when he comes in for his implant and his reading, his pressures are, let's just look at the blue line. That's the mean pressure. Red is systolic, green is diastolic. Gray is where it should be. And look where it is. It is twice what it should be at a very experienced center. And we're seeing this again and again. So then the doctors make a series of medication changes. And over a period of several weeks, they're able to lower the pressure dramatically into the gray area. Sometime later, the patient gets a repeat right heart cath, which demonstrates very close agreement between the catheter and the sensor. So this is an example of what we're seeing. And what we're really finding out is, I think, as it was said earlier, that personalized medicine, this is really truly personalized medicine. What we're finding out is that different drugs work in different patients. Not every drug works in every patient. And what happens right now is that you end up patients having a lot of side effects, such as renal failure, because one medication, diuretics, keep getting pushed when perhaps they shouldn't be pushed. So we're learning a lot about individual patients. And this is so what you're seeing here is a screenshot from our database. So we have an incredible amount of information on medications, patients, time blocked to responses, which this data has never been available before. So we're very excited about this information. This is an example from not a prominent heart failure center. This is a regular cardiologist in real life, and similar things. So he's done a good job. He's got lots of medications. Patient with heart failure, he's an interventionalist, and he puts a sensor in. The pressures are a lot higher than he thought. He makes a series of changes on the basis of the information, and he's able to get the pressures down. And then one last case from another prominent heart failure doctor, Dr. Costanza. So she puts this patient in, and this is a little more complicated patient. This patient has heart failure so Dr. Costanza thought the patient only had heart failure, so she put him in the study. Turns out when you look at the numbers, the patient actually has pulmonary hypertension in addition to heart failure, the PVR, which is a resistance. I won't digress too much, but this patient has two disease states. She has bad left ventricular function, but also has pulmonary hypertension. Normally what would happen is that would not have been figured out. They would keep hammering this patient with heart failure drugs. The patient would do badly. But with the sensor, they're able to figure this out. And so instead of just using heart failure drugs, she adds a medication, sildenafil, which is for pulmonary hypertension, and is able to get a good outcome in this patient, which would not have happened otherwise. Just finishing up here, the first product we actually commercialized, the only product we commercialized, is for aneurysms, actually. And this was on the way to heart failure. We wanted to perfect the technology in a less strenuous location. Aortic aneurysms are these outpouches that you see which tend to rupture. Over the last several years, we've started doing stent grafting, which are these, that tube that you see there, which is a lot better than the traditional surgery. The sensor goes in right here and lets you measure the pressure so you know that the sac has been decompressed. It ruptures if it has not been decompressed, right? And so we're able to do that. This is just showing an example. Before the stent graft, the pressure is high. After the stent graft, the pressure tracing becomes quite low. In the interest of time, I'll skip this case example of that, but this is an elderly patient who had this happen to them, and the increase in pressure is picked up. 10 months later, the doctor, and the pressure, the leaks are very hard to pick up. This is the actual leak. I mean, you would never pick this up, okay? It's a little faint blush here. Yet it leads to high pressures. We can measure lots of other things besides pressure. This really is a wireless communication technology, and there are applications that go outside of the heart, and we've done lots of work in these areas in animal experiments typically. What you're seeing here is some of the hardware that's used in spinal fusion, and we can actually integrate our sensing technology right into these devices and measure the degree of fusion, movement of the spine, implants. Right now, if you'll give me one more minute, this is actually interesting. This is an artificial knee that you're seeing here. And when we replace joints, we eliminate all sensory information, or what's called proprioception. And this was figured out a long time ago. In the 19th century, there was a French neurologist, Charcot, who's the father of modern neurology, and he described the Charcot joint, which occurred in patients with syphilis. In advanced syphilis, the sensory nerves are damaged, so you get no proprioception. And these patients develop a very rapid arthritis, arthropathy. So when you don't have information, things don't do very well. So right now what we have are dumb implants with no information, so they wear out, they do badly. What we're doing is adding intelligence to these implants, creating smart implants. You'll have some information, some feedback from these implants, so they should behave much more like what you were born with and should do much better. So eventually what we see is a wireless body network, in-body, intra-body wireless, measuring a number of parameters, all of that information being fed back to a central location, including for liver disease. One of the, in Dr. Blumberg's research, one of the interesting things we've worked on is portal hypertension after hepatitis, is being able to measure portal vein pressure and manage these patients much more efficiently. So our goal, all of this though, is for a purpose, which is to reduce hospitalizations, keep people out of the hospital, and spend more time at home. Thank you very much.
Dr. Yadav, thank you. That presentation really blew me away. Fantastic work that you are doing in CardioMEMS, and we've got a good 10 minutes here for questions. So please line up at the microphone and introduce your name, and if you feel comfortable, your affiliation.
Very nice talk, Dr. Yadav. Marina Brockway from VivaQuant. I thought you mentioned that you're measuring flow as well, and I'm curious how you do that. And let me explain why I think it's important. The real gold standard in monitoring heart failure patients is actually monitoring filling pressure, which is left atrial pressure. And Swan-Ganz catheter is able, measurements can do that because they block flow. And like in every Ohm's law equation, flow and resistance matter for that. So I think there is a compartmental differences between measuring pressure in pulmonary artery and left atrium.
Yeah. Yeah, great question. So there's always a trade-off in medicine, right? So to measure left atrial pressure, you have to put a device on the left side of the heart. And for those in the audience, that's not a place where we put devices because the left side of the heart goes directly to your brain. So you will have no device in the left side of the heart for that simple reason, because the stroke risk is prohibitively high. So we want to stick in the lung, the capillary bed of the capillary network of the lung serves as a filter and prevents things that occur in your veins from getting to your brain, is largely the function of that. So the beauty of the Swan-Ganz system is it lets you measure that left atrial pressure without actually being on the left side of the heart. There's a very close correlation, particularly certain parts of the cardiac cycle, between left atrial pressure and diastolic pressure in the pulmonary artery. So that's been well worked out. So if we can measure pulmonary artery systolic, diastolic mean pressure, we have a very close measurement of the left atrial pressure indirectly. The way we're measuring flow, we have two different techniques for doing it. One is very straightforward, which is to have two sensors. Then I think it's fairly evident how that would work, that are geographically separated. The other one is by having a lot of information on the waveform. And this is some work that actually Dr. Borge pioneered several years ago. There's a lot of information in the waveform from which you can derive flow, assuming some assumptions, such as the pulmonic valve area is constant, which in adults it is. So with certain assumptions, one can actually impute flow and cardiac output on the basis of rapid change. And that's why you need the dynamic response. You need lots of data of the pressure cycle in order to measure that.
Hi. Well, thank you for a very interesting talk. So my name is Jordan Penders. I'm from a Whole Center IMEC. First a comment, I think I've been mentioning a couple of early adopters of wireless sensor networks in wellness and lifestyle. I think this is a remarkable example of early adopters in healthcare. So thanks for that. Then I have a couple of questions. I'll just focus to one now. So what you presented, it's a solution which has a RF link, which I understand is proprietary, probably. So I was wondering what was your vision and your opinion on all these standardization efforts which are currently ongoing? Just to make my question a bit more specific, today what is standardized is between, let's say, the gateway and the access to the data. So you have Wi-Fi, GPRS, GSM networks. So this is pretty much standardized. I'm talking here at the standardization between the wireless sensors and the gateway itself.
Sure. That's a very interesting question. And you know, we started this a while ago and a little bit ahead of the curve here, but I agree with you that is a goal. And we're actually looking at in our neuro, I didn't get a chance to talk about a neuro application. We're looking at an intracranial pressure monitoring application where we actually are looking at using either Zigbee or Wi-Fi as the communication protocol. And this will go directly to your General Electric or Siemens or Philips hospital monitor. So that is the goal. And the next phase is to make that very seamless, make the electronics really a dongle that plugs in to your monitor at the bedside. So you eliminate the electronics completely. So I think that is the direction we're headed. But when we started doing this, there were no standards exactly for this. So, but I think that will happen.
Great. Final question?
Brian Brockway, Nanomedical. How do you know that the measurements being taken by the device are accurate over time? Obviously, very small changes in filling pressure are clinically significant, and it's very difficult to get a pressure sensor that has zero drift. How do you recalibrate in vivo, or how do you know that the measurements that you're taking are accurate over time?
Sure, Brian. So I think I showed some of that data. I think that's where the MEMS technology is really key, because when you make traditional metallic titanium sensors, there is significant drift over time, and that's been an issue. And so you had to have recalibration techniques, which require invasive procedures typically, although you can do indirect calibration without invasive procedures. So that's one reason we went to this technology, where the drift is 0.1 millimeters of mercury per year over 20 years of fatigue testing. It's because of the nature of the sensor, the very small amounts of movement that actually occur, and the hermetic sealing we're able to obtain. So that really is the key. So in the cardiac application, it does not require recalibration for the life of the patient. And we have data out to 2-3 years now in some of the initial feasibility patients.
We have data with other devices out now to 7 years, but 1% drift.
And is there zero failure rate of the technology?
So far we have approximately 6,000 implants in the aneurysm space, and all those sensors are working. So I would not say zero. I'm sure if we have 100,000 implants, there is going to be a failure rate. But the failure rate, I think this really is a technological leap as we go toward. I think in medicine, and that's the wonderful thing about this conference. I think, medicine's always far behind where technology is. So the computer scientists, the chip manufacturers are always light years ahead of where we are. One small digression, for example, nitinol, which we use a lot in stents now. Well, nitinol was invented in 1950, okay? It took till the 1990s to get a medical product with nitinol. So we're way behind. And so I think, we have to start adopting some of these technologies that are out there to make much better and more durable medical devices.
Well, that's great, Dr. Yadav. Again, thank you for a fantastic presentation. I really applaud CardioMEMS. It's truly exemplifying everything that this conference is about and about the next decade in medicine. We now have a very well-deserved coffee break, and I would like to ask everybody to go next door for the coffee break, and please be back for a prompt start at 9:30. Thank you.